The value they placed on her was that of a lame horse, the final contempt of her own people. But this woman, sold as useless, would become the secret architect who would turn her captor into a king. If stories about the power of resilience resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. The sound of rifles echoed through the canyon walls, bullets ricocheting off the stones with a deadly hum. Crouched behind a rock, Isora felt the dust of the earth in her mouth, her heart pounding uncontrollably against her ribs. The smell of gunpowder and fear hung in the dry air, mingling with the sweat that ran down her forehead. Beside her, Teo, the Apache leader who now depended on her, nocked an arrow, his dark eyes fixed on the canyon ridge, where the Mexican soldiers were advancing relentlessly. He didn't look at her, but his voice was an urgent murmur, cutting through the noise of the combat. The path, Isora. Now. To the soldiers, she was just a nameless captive, one more target. To the Apache warriors around her, she was the only hope of escaping annihilation, the woman who knew the secrets whispered by the earth itself. Every breath was a struggle, every second an eternity. Isora closed her eyes for an instant, not to pray, but to visualize the map she carried in her mind, a legacy from her mother. She saw the invisible fissures in the rock, the passages hidden by shadow and vegetation, the labyrinth that promised salvation. The weight of dozens of lives rested on her shoulders, a terrifying responsibility for someone who, weeks before, believed she was worthless. Opening her eyes, she met Teo's gaze. In it, there was no longer the coldness of a captor, but the raw tension of a leader betting everything on a single, improbable card. With a determined nod, she pointed to a dark crevice that most would dismiss as an animal's den. That was the way. Her voice, though trembling, carried a new authority. Follow me, and don't stop, no matter what happens. But to understand how we reached this point, we need to go back in time. Before she was the key to survival, Isora was a shadow on the outskirts of a Mexican fort in the Sierra de Chihuahua. Born to an indigenous mother and a Mexican father, she belonged nowhere. To the soldiers, she was the Indian. To the natives who passed through, she was the Mexican. This duality condemned her to an existence of invisibility, where she learned to move without being noticed, to listen without seeming to hear, and to observe everything with desperate attention. Her only connection to the world came from her mother, a woman who taught her to read the land like a book. Every hill had a story, every type of rock indicated the presence of water, every plant was a pharmacy or a poison. These were the secrets of her mother's people, whispered on starry nights like a forbidden treasure. Her mother's death, however, left her completely at the mercy of her father, a man brutalized by life on the frontier who saw his daughter only as a burden and a constant reminder of a union that had brought him shame. Isora's fragility was not physical, but a deep wound in her soul, a feeling of uselessness fed by years of contempt. She moved through her days in resigned silence, serving, cleaning, existing only to avoid causing trouble. Her eyes, though sharp and capable of memorizing vast territories with photographic precision, were kept downcast, hiding the brilliance of a mind that no one cared to discover. She convinced herself that she was exactly what her father and the world saw, a broken object without purpose or value. The day of the trade came without warning, bathed in the cruel desert sun. A small Apache band, led by a young warrior named Teo, approached the fort. They came not to fight, but to negotiate, exhausted and pressed by Mexican patrols. Isora watched from a distance, as she always did, until her father grabbed her roughly by the arm and dragged her forward. The air grew heavy. She saw the object of the trade, a thin brown horse with one of its forelegs visibly injured, an animal that could barely stand. Her father spoke in a low voice with Teo, and though she didn't understand the Apache language, the tone of contempt in his own was unmistakable. She was being offered as merchandise. The humiliation was a physical blow, knocking the air out of her. Teo, a pragmatic and weary leader, looked at the horse with pity and then at Isora. His eyes showed no cruelty, but a deep exhaustion. To him, the trade was absurd, but perhaps a burden was better than a dying animal. With a brief nod, the deal was sealed. Isora did not cry or scream. A cold paralysis took over her body as her father turned his back on her without a word of farewell. She was handed over to the Apaches, the sound of the lame horse's hoof echoing in her mind as the official price of her life. In that moment, the conviction of her worthlessness solidified. She was the woman who was worth less than a crippled animal. The journey to the Apache camp was a blur of dust, fear, and silence. Isora walked barefoot, the sharp desert stones cutting her skin, but the external pain was nothing compared to the emptiness she felt inside. When they arrived at the band's hideout, a precarious camp nestled among the rocks, she was met not with violence, but with something perhaps worse, a mixture of distrust and indifference. The faces of the warriors and women were masks of severity. She was the stranger, the half-breed, a potential problem brought by their leader in a moment of incomprehensible weakness or pity. One warrior in particular, Kyle, stared at her with open hostility, seeing her as a bad omen, another mouth to feed in times of scarcity. Isora was left in a corner, alone with her thoughts. The language was an insurmountable barrier, every word exchanged around her sounding like a confirmation of her exclusion. She watched the daily routines, the way the women worked the leather, how the children played under the watchful eyes of the elders, and felt a pang of something she barely remembered, the longing to belong. However, here, as at the fort, she was on the outside, a loose part in a complex machine. The freedom her father had taken from her was replaced by a new form of captivity, one where the bars were not made of iron, but of suspicious glances and a crushing silence. The surrounding desert seemed a mirror of her soul, vast, unforgiving, and terribly lonely. Isora's courage in this moment is what inspires us. If you also feel that strength, show your support by leaving a comment. And to not miss a single step of this and other incredible journeys of overcoming, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The first few days were a test of endurance. Food was scarce, water was rationed. Isora received the minimum to survive, portions given almost as an afterthought. She performed the tasks imposed on her in silence, gathering firewood, carrying water when they found it, always under the watchful eye of Kyle, who seemed to be waiting for a mistake, an excuse to confirm his suspicions about her. His hostility was a subtle poison, influencing the others who kept her at a distance. Isora withdrew into herself, the belief in her own worthlessness deepening with each passing day. She was a burden, just as her father had made her believe, and she was just waiting for the moment she would be discarded, abandoned to her own fate in the merciless desert. However, even in her despair, her mother's teachings persisted like an echo. Her eyes, accustomed to being downcast, began to look up, not to face people, but to read the landscape. She noticed the subtle moisture in the morning air, the type of vegetation that clung to the shaded faces of the rocks, the flight patterns of birds at dusk. These were details that the others, preoccupied with hunting and watching for soldiers, might have overlooked. This knowledge, once a secret, comfort, now transformed into a tool. She began to understand the territory not as a prisoner, but as a reader of its secrets, not yet realizing that those pages held the key to rewriting her own destiny. The opportunity to change her fortune arose from the most terrible of needs, thirst. The band had been on the move for days, fleeing a Mexican patrol, and the last water source they knew of had run dry. The canteens were almost empty, and everyone's lips, including the children's, were cracked and dry, The tension in the camp was palpable. Dehydration weakened the warriors and undermined their hope. Teo had sent scouts in all directions, but they returned with the same grim news. There was nothing. Despair began to set in, and Kyle's accusing glares at Isora intensified, as if her mere presence had offended the spirits of the land. It was then that Isora, moved by an instinct that overcame her fear, approached Teo. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but firm. She didn't speak his language, so she used gestures, pointing to a chain of hills to the west, and then drawing the symbol of a specific plant in the sand, one her mother had taught her grew only where water runs under the earth, even if it isn't visible. Teo looked at her skeptically, and Kale openly scoffed. Leading the band on a wild goose chase based on the guess of a stranger was madness. However, there was a certainty in Isora's eyes that Teo hadn't seen since he'd traded her for the horse. In an act of faith, or sheer desperation, he gave the order to follow the direction she indicated. The walk under the scorching sun was a silent torture. Every step was a gamble, and the weight of the band's skepticism was almost as overwhelming as the heat. Isora led the way, her focus entirely on the landscape, searching for the signs her memory held. She dared not look back at the exhausted and distrustful faces. After hours that felt like a lifetime, she stopped in a small rocky depression that seemed as dry and lifeless as the rest of the desert. Kyle spat on the ground, a look of bitter triumph on his face. The farce was over, but Isora ignored him. She knelt and with her hands began to dig in the sand at the base of a rock wall, where a tuft of the plant she had drawn was growing. At first, nothing happened. Just dry sand and more sand. A murmur of discontent grew among the group. Teo approached, his face an impenetrable mask, but Isora continued with a feverish determination, feeling the slight dampness that only she seemed to notice. And then it happened. The sand turned dark and moist. A moment later, a small puddle of muddy water began to form in the hole she had dug. A collective sigh swept through the band. It wasn't a river, but it was life. As the others rushed to fill their canteens, Teo looked at Isora differently for the first time. She was not just a captive, she was something more. The respect she earned that day was not expressed in words, but in the silence that followed, and in the small canteen of water that one of the warriors offered her before he even drank himself. The water episode opened a small crack in the wall of distrust surrounding Isora. The most significant change came from an unexpected source. Nalin, the old healer of the band, widow of the former chief and a woman whose wisdom was revered by all. Nalin had been watching Isora for some time, not with the suspicion of the others, but with a patient curiosity. She saw beyond the frightened half-breed. She saw the eyes that read the land, the silent resilience that kept her on her feet. After the day Isora found the hidden spring, Nalin called her to her fire. For the first time, someone in the camp spoke to her, not to give an order, but to share knowledge. Using a mix of gestures and simple words that Isora was beginning to learn, Nalin began her tutelage. She taught Isora the Apache names for the plants, not just their practical uses, but their spiritual meanings. She showed her how to heal wounds with tree resins and how to listen to the wind to predict the weather. More than that, Nalin began to share the stories of the Ende, the people, their beliefs and traditions. She treated Isora not as a servant, but as a student, a potential granddaughter. For Isora, who had never known a motherly affection since her own mother's death, Nalin's care was like water to a parched plant. She began to absorb the culture, the language, and slowly to feel the first fragile seed of belonging sprout in her chest. With Nalin's support, Isora found a voice. She began to subtly participate in the women's activities, learning the complex art of preparing hides and sewing moccasins. Her dexterity and quick learning did not go unnoticed. and the respect she had gained with the water solidified into a cautious acceptance. She still felt the weight of Kale's stare, but it was no longer the only thing she saw. Now, there were also the discreet smiles of some of the women and Narlins. Protective gaze. The old healer saw Isora's geographical knowledge not as a simple skill, but as a spiritual gift, a deep connection with the Jiu, the sacred mountains that were the heart of her people. This newfound confidence culminated in a decisive moment. During a discussion about which route to take to avoid the increasingly frequent patrols, Isora realized that the path chosen by the warriors would lead them directly into an area of narrow gorges, a perfect trap. Fear paralyzed her for a moment, the old instinct to remain invisible screaming at her to stay silent. But the image of the children's faces and of Narlin spurred her on. She stepped forward and, for the first time, addressed Teo directly in front of the other warriors. Using the Apache words she had learned, still hesitant, she explained the danger, describing the topography of the place with a clarity that stunned the men. She wasn't asking, she was asserting. Isora's boldness hung in the air, thick and unexpected. Kale immediately challenged her, accusing her of cowardice and of trying to mislead them for her own nefarious ends. He argued that she, an outsider, could not know more than the warriors who were born and raised in those mountains. The tension was extreme. The band's future was at a stalemate, depending on the word of a captive against that of a respected warrior. Teo listened to both sides in silence, his face inscrutable. He looked at the map Isora had drawn on the ground, a detailed and accurate sketch that spoke more than her faltering words. Then he looked into her eyes and saw not arrogance, but conviction. He made his decision. "We will follow her path," Teo declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Kyle's look of impotent rage was almost as significant as Isora's sigh of relief. That day, she ceased to be a possession and became an advisor. Meanwhile, far from the Apache camp, the threat pursuing them gained a face and a name: Captain Morales, a man forged in the brutality of the frontier war. Morales was not just a soldier following orders. He had a personal obsession with eradicating the Apaches, whom he saw as savages hindering Mexican progress. Recently, he had captured and tortured an old trader who, before dying, revealed a crucial piece of information. The half-breed daughter of a local settler, recently traded to the Apaches, was the only person alive who knew the location of a secret network of springs and passages, a map her late explorer, grandfather, had created. Morales instantly realized the strategic value of this information. Finding the Apaches was no longer the only goal. Now he needed to capture the girl. She was the key to the total annihilation of his enemies. Morales's hunt became methodical and relentless. He was not just a commander, he was a hunter. With the information extracted from the trader, he began to connect the dots, understanding why Teo's band could disappear so effectively. It wasn't just luck or Apache. Skill. They had a guide. Their survival, their ability to find water where others perished, all pointed to the girl's presence. Morales's obsession with Isora grew, transforming her from a simple strategic tool into a personal prize. He saw in her the personification of indigenous resistance, a living secret he needed to possess and crush to declare his final victory over the land and its people. Teo's band soon felt the noose tightening. Morales's patrols seemed to be everywhere, forcing them to move constantly, abandoning camps in a hurry and covering their tracks with desperate care. Life became a perpetual escape. On one occasion, they narrowly escaped an ambush, hiding in a narrow cave as soldiers passed just meters away. In the darkness of the cave, hearing the voices of Morales's men, Isora felt a chilling terror she hadn't experienced since the day she was sold. She understood that she wasn't just fleeing as part of the band. She was the target. The knowledge her mother had given her as a gift for life, had become the reason she was being hunted to the death. Isora's value to the band became undeniable. Her photographic memory of the terrain allowed them to move through routes that not even the most experienced scouts knew, using the environment as their greatest weapon. She guided them through dry riverbeds to hide their tracks and over rocky ridges where the soldiers' horses couldn't pass. Teo began to consult her openly, treating her knowledge not as a mystical gift, as Nalin suggested, but as vital military intelligence. He saw the landscape through her eyes and began to think not just about fleeing, but about how to use the terrain to counterattack. The dynamic between them changed, evolving into a partnership forged in necessity and cemented by a silent, mutual respect. Even Kale, though still hostile, could no longer deny the effectiveness of her guidance. His survival, and that of the entire band, depended directly on the woman he had so despised. This dependence, however, did not diminish his resentment. On the contrary, it fueled it. He saw Teo's growing trust in Isora as a weakness, a dangerous break from tradition. To him, her influence was diluting the band's strength, making them reliant on an outsider, instead of trusting only in their own power and the old ways. The tension between Kyle and Isora became a fault line within the group, a crack threatening to split open under the constant pressure of Morales' pursuit. Isora's internal turning point occurred on a cold night as she sat near Nalin, mending a leather pouch. She listened to Teo and the other warriors discussing in low voices on the other side of the fire. The conversation was grim. Their scouts reported that all the southern passes were guarded by soldiers. To the north, an impassable desert stretched out. Morales' strategy was clear. He was pushing them eastward, into a region of gorges known as the Devil's Mouth, a labyrinth of canyons from which few ever emerged. The warriors debated desperate routes, each one riskier than the last. They were trapped, and desperation was beginning to erode their discipline. As she listened, Isora realized the magnitude of the secret she still held. The knowledge she had shared so far was just the surface, fragments of the great mental map her mother had bequeathed to her. She knew a route, a secret passage through the Devil's Mouth that was not on any Mexican map. But this path led to the most sacred and hidden place her mother had described to her, the heart of the mountain, a system of caves with a perennial spring. To reveal this secret would be to give away the last part of herself, her mother's most intimate inheritance, to a people who still viewed her with suspicion. To keep it, however, would be to condemn them to death. In that moment, looking at Nalin's wrinkled face and the heavy responsibility on Teo's shoulders, Isora made a decision. They were no longer her captors. They were her people, and she would save them, whatever the cost. The trap, when it sprang, was as swift as it was lethal. Using a captured Apache scout, Morales managed to anticipate Teo's next move, forcing the band to retreat exactly where he wanted them, into a deep, dead-end gorge. The rock walls rose on both sides, steep and unforgiving. The only entrance was now blocked by Mexican troops, their rifles positioned on the ridges, controlling the only way in or out. The silence that fell over the canyon was more terrifying than any war cry. They were cornered like animals in a cage, exposed under the open sky, with the sun beating down and no water source in sight. Hope evaporated as quickly as the last drops in their canteens. The atmosphere in the makeshift camp turned poisonous, fear turned into recrimination, and all eyes turned to a single target, Isora. Her guidance had led them here. Although she had saved them before, this mistake seemed to be the final one. Kyle, seeing his opportunity, began to openly incite the other warriors. His voice echoed through the camp, filled with anger and accusation. He called her a spy, a traitor who had deliberately led them into Morales' hands. He argued that Teo's trust in the outsider had sealed their fate. The band's unity, already frayed by the constant flight, began to shatter, with men taking up arms not to fight the Mexicans, but each other. The situation deteriorated rapidly. With the last drops of water consumed, thirst began to torment them, making the air thin and their minds feverish. The children cried silently in their mother's arms, and the warriors, once proud and defiant, now looked at the canyon walls with a grim resignation. Death no longer seemed a possibility, but an imminent certainty. They could die fighting in a suicidal charge against the soldiers' rifles, or they could die slowly of thirst under the relentless sun. Captain Morales knew this. He didn't need to attack, he just had to wait. The desert and despair would do his work for him. Kyle's rebellion gained momentum. He gathered a group of warriors who shared his fear and distrust, arguing that the only chance of survival was to hand Isora over to Morales. Perhaps, he said, the captain would be satisfied with his prize and let the rest of the band go. It was a desperate gamble, born of panic, that split the camp in two. Teo and the warriors loyal to him formed a protective circle around Isora and Nalin, their spears and arrows, now aimed at their own brothers. The final confrontation, it seemed, would not be against the Mexicans who surrounded them, but right there, on the dusty floor of the gorge, among the Apache people themselves. The band was on the verge of self-destruction. At the peak of the tension, when the first blow seemed about to be struck, Isora stepped forward, out of Teo's protective circle. Silence fell instantly, all eyes fixed on her. Her face was caked with dust and exhaustion, but her eyes shone, with an intensity no one had ever seen. She did not look to Teo for permission, nor to Kale with fear or anger. She looked at each member of the band, her people, and then raised her voice. It was no longer the hesitant whisper of a captive, but the clear, resonant tone of a leader. "You are wrong," she said in Apache, the words perfectly formed. "I did not bring us here to die. I brought us here to survive." She turned to the seemingly solid wall of the canyon, a face of rock that appeared impassable. "You see a trap. I see a door." With an authority that silenced even Kyle, she revealed her deepest secret. She spoke not just of an escape route, but of a sanctuary, the heart of the mountain. She described a system of caves hidden by that very wall, a place with a spring that never ran dry, large enough to shelter them all. A refuge that would make them invisible and give them the strength to fight again. She explained that the entrance was a narrow, almost imperceptible fissure, and that the path to reach it was dangerous, under the direct fire of the soldiers. It was a chance, perhaps the only one, but it demanded the unthinkable. Isora's revelation hung in the air, a mixture of hope and disbelief. Salvation was just a few meters away, hidden in plain sight. But the path to it was a death run. To reach the cave entrance, they would have to cross a strip of exposed ground, directly in the line of sight of Morales's snipers. It would be an act of blind faith, a desperate race under a hail of bullets. Kyle and his followers still hesitated, their distrust warring with the promise of water and safety. The final decision, everyone knew, rested with Teo. He, the leader who had accepted her in exchange for a lame horse, now had to decide whether to bet the lives of his entire people on her word. Teo looked at Isora, and in her eyes he saw the truth of her words, the courage that overcame fear. He saw the culmination of her journey, from captive to savior. Firm nod, he turned to his warriors. "She speaks the truth. She is our way." He gave no more time for doubt. Quickly organizing the escape, he positioned his best archers to provide cover, creating a barrage of arrows to distract the soldiers. The order was given. Women and children would go first, running in small groups while the warriors returned fire. Isora would go in front to guide everyone. The climax had arrived. With a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls, Teo gave the signal, and the first group ran, placing their faith and their lives in the hands of the woman they once considered useless. The run was a blur of chaos and courage, the air filled with the sound of gunshots, screams, and whistling arrows. Isora ran, her heart pounding not from fear but from the adrenaline of leading her people to safety. She guided them to the fissure in the rock, pushing children and women into the saving darkness, while Teo's warriors held the defensive line with desperate ferocity. One by one they entered, disappearing from the view of the confused soldiers who fired at shadows and echoes. Teo was the last to enter, his shoulder bleeding from a graze, but his eyes shining with triumph. The passage closed behind them, plunging them into darkness and a blessed silence far from Morales' reach. When they lit torches, the sight that greeted them was breathtaking. They were not in a simple cave, but in a vast underground hall with stalactites hanging from the ceiling like stone chandeliers, and in the center the most beautiful sound they could imagine, the murmur of running water. A spring gushed directly from the rock, forming a pool of crystal-clear water. It was the heart of the mountain, the refuge of legends, a place of safety and renewal. A collective cry of relief and joy echoed through the cave. The people drank the water, bathed their faces, hope reborn in their hearts. Kyle, in silence, approached Isora, and in a gesture of deep respect, bowed his head. The debt was unpayable, and her leadership unquestionable. The heart of the mountain became more than a refuge. It became their fortress. With a secure source of water and an impenetrable hideout, the dynamics of the conflict changed drastically. Captain Morales, furious and humiliated by the band's inexplicable escape, searched the gorge in vain, finding only tracks that vanished into a solid rock wall. While he wasted time and resources on a fruitless search, Teo, now healed and with his people safe, began to plan his response. Using the other secret passages Isora revealed to him, he led his warriors in a series of swift and devastating guerrilla attacks against Morales' supply lines and outposts. The raids were precise and ghostly. Teo's warriors emerged from the rocks, attacked, and disappeared before the Mexican army could organize a defense. Teo's reputation grew exponentially. Other Apache bands, scattered and demoralized, heard the stories of the leader who commanded the mountain spirits, who appeared and vanished like the wind. They began to seek him out, looking for his leadership and protection. Teo, with Isora's strategic guidance, unified the fragmented factions, forging a powerful alliance. He did not become a king in the European sense, with a crown and a throne, but something much more significant. He became the living legend of the resistance, the most revered and powerful leader those lands had seen in generations. Isora found her true place. She was no longer a captive, a servant, or an outsider. She was given a new name, Guardian of the Paths, a title of immense honor and responsibility. She became Teo's chief advisor, his partner in leadership, their minds working in sync to protect and guide their people. Her voice was heard with respect in the councils, and her wisdom was sought as much as Narlin's. The wound of abandonment and worthlessness finally began to heal, filled by the love and respect of the family she had chosen, and that had chosen her back. She finally understood that her value came not from her lineage or the price they paid for her, but from the strength of her spirit and the wisdom she carried within her. Isora's story teaches us that resilience is not about not falling, but about the strength we find to get back up, often in the most unexpected places. It shows us that a person's true worth cannot be measured by material goods or the contempt of others, but by the courage to use one's unique gifts to light the way in times of darkness. The lame horse was the price of the transaction, but Isora's knowledge was what bought the freedom of a nation. If this message touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share this story so that more people can be inspired by the power of transformation and hope. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.